Subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Pursuant to Committee Rule 2E and House Rule 11, the Chair announces that he may postpone roll call votes. Pursuant to notice, the Subcommittee on Energy meets to consider the following measures: H.R. 4091, the Arpa-E Reauthorization Act of 2019, and H.R. 4230, the Clean Industrial Technology Act of 2019. I'm pleased to consider these two bipartisan bills today. I think they are absolutely essential to our nation's clean energy future. They were considered at three hearings earlier this Congress, where we brought together experts from industry, academia, the Department of Energy. We talked about Arpa-E and also R&D to reduce emissions from the manufacturing sector. I'm an original co-sponsor of H.R. 4091, the bipartisan Arpa-E Reauthorization Act, which Chairwoman Johnson took the lead on and we introduced in July. Arpa-E was first authorized by this committee back in 2007. I think it has tremendous promise to help us solve one of our longest-term challenges, which is the future of low-carbon energy production in this country. Congress recognized this back then, and we have maintained our leadership in this research overall, creating jobs, benefiting the energy sector, and of course the environment. But we think that there's a lot more we can do. Groundbreaking research involves a high level of risk, some of which the private sector is able to take, but a lot of it it can't bear alone, so we have our part to play. The first appropriation for Arpa-E was $400 million, and it was made exactly 10 years ago. In that time, Arpa-E and the people it's given grants to have done incredible work, but the budget has had stagnant, if any, growth. I don't believe in that. I think that when the government is doing something right and doing it well, especially in cooperation with other segments of our society, that's an occasion to double down, especially on a challenge this important. So this bill answers the call of the national academies and the leading energy think tanks who have all called for significantly increasing Arpa-E's budget to allow them to do even more of the great work they're already doing. This will ensure that Arpa-E actually has the impact we want it to have, not just individually excellent projects, but an overall sector-wide impact that can help us change the future of energy in this country. Many people have recognized this, and that's why the Arpa-E reauthorization bill is now endorsed by those ranging from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to the Natural Resources Defense Council, the American Gas Association, and the American Council for Renewable Energy. You don't always see those groups on the same side of an individual piece of legislation, but in this case, we have all their support, and I thank them for that. The second bill we're looking at today is H.R. 4230, the Clean Industrial Technology Act, which is introduced by my colleague, Representative Caston, and it is also a bipartisan bill. We've made a lot of strides in the past couple of decades in reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector, but we still have a real uphill climb when it comes to manufacturing and heavy industry. That's about 25% of our nation's emissions, yet only about 6% of the Department of Energy's research budget has been dedicated to this, and we have no national plan devoted to solving this problem. So this bill will help address those issues by authorizing a cross-agency, DOE-led R&D and demonstration program to advance these technologies from industrial sources of emissions, including steel, cement, chemical production, and industrial heat. Importantly, this program will operate in collaboration with stakeholders from industry and labor groups to make sure the people who are, essentially the boots on the ground in these sectors have a say in the investment we're going to make as a nation. DOE has succeeded with large demonstration projects before, so after the basic science and the basic research is done, actually showing it can be done on a large commercial scale. We've done that most recently and prominently with a nearly $200 million investment in a commercial scale post-combustion carbon capture coal-fired power plant in Thompson's, Texas, known as Petronova. This bill, like the others, has support from a wide array of stakeholders and groups, including the National Association of Manufacturers, the American Chemistry Council, the Steelworkers, the Blue-Green Alliance, the Union of Concerned Scientists, the Clean Air Task Force. Again, not players that you usually see on the same side of the field, but in this case, we have them. So we think it's essential to ensure that American manufacturers can access these new technologies and the technologies that are still to come so that they will remain competitive throughout the 21st century and in fact that they will have a competitive edge in the 21st century because of the demand that you're going to have for some of this clean energy. My Republican colleagues who have signed on to support these important bills have recognized that innovation must play a key role in doing our work here. And I just urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle again to consider supporting these bills. I look forward to advancing them out of the subcommittee today. And with that, I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Weber, for his opening remarks.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Lamb, for the opportunity to speak on H.R. 4091, the Arpa-E Reauthorization Act of 2019, and H.R. 4230, the Clean Industrial Technology Act of 2019. During my tenure on the Science Committee, we've had an incredible track record for passing bipartisan legislation. Just last Congress, 32 of the 34 bills from this committee, an outstanding 94%, received bipartisan support. In fact, this energy subcommittee only worked in a bipartisan fashion, with all 9 energy-related bills passing the House with a bipartisan support from Science Committee members. Now, we certainly had different opinions on a whole range of policy issues, but at the end of the day, when it came to legislating, we focused on the areas where we indeed had common ground. Unfortunately, that is not the case of this Congress, and today we are holding yet another partisan markup, in my opinion. The 2 bills we will consider today may be characterized as bipartisan because of a single co-sponsor, which, by the way, is not a member of this committee, because once again, both bills propose reckless budget increases without including any offsets in spending, something I simply cannot and will not support. The first H.R. 4091, the Arpa-E Reauthorization Act of 2019, would actually increase Arpa-E's authorization by, listen to this, 173% to $1 billion with a B in fiscal year 2024. This funding level is both unrealistic and unproductive. Such a high rate of increase would be challenging for any program to effectively manage. But Arpa-E is particularly unsuited for the task, and with the small staff that it has, this will be extremely difficult. Now, I want to acknowledge that this bill does make important policy reforms to DOE's Arpa-E program, building off of those, I might add, in Ranking Member Lucas's bipartisan Arpa-E legislation that passed the House last Congress. While I support these reforms, we don't need to drastically increase Arpa-E's funding to implement them. It is unfortunate that we're unable to meet in the middle and reach a compromise on funding for this program. I'll be the first to admit, I and many of my conservative colleagues on this committee have been skeptical of Arpa-E, and I have voted many times to cut spending for the program. But I believe that Ranking Member Lucas's most recent Arpa-E bill, which has nearly identical policy reforms, paired with authorization levels that were supported by both Chairwoman Johnson last Congress and this committee, is a responsible compromise approach. I encourage the chairman and the committee to consider that legislation. The second bill we will consider today, H.R. 4230, the Clean Industrial Technology Act of 2019, seeks to develop technologies to reduce emissions in industrial sectors. And while I agree that there is a need for collaboration in developing new technologies to reduce emissions, I'm concerned that we're rushing to move to a major authorization without doing our homework. For example, I support the establishment of the Federal Advisory Committee in Section 4 of the bill. But before we authorize a new program, shouldn't we first make sure this advisory committee has developed an effective research roadmap and goals for that program? Don't we want the experts from industry, academia, and the agencies to be able to weigh in before blindly committing taxpayer dollars? This legislation also includes language that delegates authority for setting spending levels to the appropriators. If we don't know how much a program should cost, we have no business authorizing that program. Why don't we take the time to hear from stakeholders on what is needed, and let's do our job? We all support basic research. We all want to see the United States remain a leader in energy technology. And we can and should work together to send bipartisan legislation to the House floor. So in closing, I want to emphasize that I support the intent behind both of these bills. But unfortunately, I cannot and will not support a bill where we haven't done our due diligence or where we're making promises that we simply cannot keep. So let's stop wasting time. Let's get back up to work on the areas that we can all agree and get our job done. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
We will now consider H.R. 4091, the Arpa-E Reauthorization Act of 2019. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 4091, a bill.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize Chairwoman Johnson to present her remarks on the bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I am pleased that we are now considering H.R. 4091, the bipartisan Arpa-E Reauthorization Act of 2019, led by myself and Chairman Lamb. Even though the agency is still relatively young, Arpa-E has already demonstrated incredible success in advancing high-risk, high-reward energy technology solutions that neither the public sector nor the private sector had been willing or able to support in the past. Industry leaders like Bill Gates and Chad Holliday and Norm Alstein have repeatedly called for significantly increasing this agency's budget, given the unique role it is now playing in our energy innovation pipeline. Arpa-E's impressive track record now includes over $2.9 billion in private sector follow-on funding for a group of 145 Arpa-E projects since the agency's founding in 2009. Equally notable, 76 projects have formed new companies. 131 projects have shown enough promise to result in partnerships with other government agencies, and Arpa-E projects have led to 2,489 peer-reviewed journal articles and 346 U.S. patents. Unfortunately, Arpa-E has only been able to support about 1% of the proposals submitted for its open funding opportunities, and 12% of proposals submitted for its focused programs, even though the number of promising high-quality proposals that the agency has received is many times higher. That is why I'm proud to sponsor H.R. 4091, the Arpa-E Reauthorization Act of 2019, which authorizes substantial growth and support for the agency over the next 5 years. This growth is consistent with the National Academy's original recommendations for establishing and supporting Arpa-E, as well as more recent recommendations from well-respected bipartisan and nonpartisan institutions, such as the Bipartisan Policy Centers, American Energy Innovation Council, the Energy Futures Initiative, and the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. I'd also note that it's in its review of the program released in 2017, the National Academy has found that a significant increase in funding would be necessary for Arpa-E to be able to support the scale-up of several particularly promising technologies that were previously supported by the agency. But many of these new approaches are still too risky to be supported by the private sector alone, and too often other DOE programs remain ill-suited to steward them. By authorizing these resources, this bill ensures that Arpa-E is able to fully pursue the development and demonstration of truly transformational clean energy technologies, just as DARPA, the agency on which Arpa-E is modeled, has been able to do time and time again for defense applications. This bill also authorizes Arpa-E to better address DOE's significant nuclear waste cleanup and management issues, something which the department currently spends billions of dollars every year trying to manage with current technologies. And it allows Arpa-E to pursue projects that improve the resilience, reliability, and security of our energy infrastructure. The Rpe Reauthorization Act of 2019 incorporates extensive feedback from stakeholders, including input from a hearing on Arpa-E this subcommittee held in February, as a matter of fact, February the 26th. It also incorporates constructive language from a bill that I co-sponsored with my friend ranking member Mr. Lucas last year. Just to name a few of the bill's many supporters, it is endorsed by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, the Council on Competitiveness, the Bipartisan Policy Center, the Association of American Universities, the Association of Public Land Grant Universities, the Nuclear Energy Institute, the American Petroleum Institute, the American Gas Association, the Energy Storage Association, Carbon Utilization Research Council, the American Council of Renewable Energy, the National Resources Defense Council, and the Energy Sciences Coalition. I submit that the full list of supporters for the record. Arpa-E's unique work is one of the best tools we have to produce the innovation needed to maintain our international competitiveness and transition ourselves to a clean energy future. If we are truly serious about using innovation to address the increasing dangers of climate change, then we must provide Arpa-E the resources to reach its immense potential. Given this bill's crucial mission, along with the deep support from industry, academia, scientific and environmental organizations, I hope that each of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will strongly support advancing H.R. 4091 this morning. With that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Does anyone else wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chairman.
So recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Lamb. We all know this committee has one of the best track records in Congress of passing productive bipartisan legislation. So I have to say I'm a little surprised and disappointed that we've been unable to reach a consensus on reauthorizing Arpa-E in a truly bipartisan way, especially given that Republicans have proposed a bill that not only includes similar program reforms, but also authorizes a responsible spending increase. Now, I'm optimistic that there are many opportunities for bipartisanship in the future, but as stewards of the taxpayers' resources, we in Congress must do our job to set realistic priorities and focus our limited federal funds where we can maximize the return on that investment. Unfortunately, the bills we're considering today don't meet that standard. H.R. 4091, the Arpa-E Reauthorization Act of 2019, includes substantial increases in funding for the program, reaching $1 billion in funding by 2024. If enacted, this bill would authorize, I won't use the word shocking, I'll just say an amazing 173% increase in spending. This legislation does include policy reforms that were first proposed in my bipartisan bill last Congress, like expanding Arpa-E's mission to include a wider range of innovative technologies and requiring the department to provide annual reports on Arpa-E projects. I support these reforms, and I know we can achieve them without irresponsibly raising spending. Now, I have spent a number of years working with Chairwoman Johnson and my friends across the aisle to support Arpa-E, and I have worked hard in this Congress to bring my Republican colleagues to the table. And I'm proud of how far we've all come on this issue. I believe there is a real opportunity to find common ground. So I'm disappointed, I will acknowledge, to see my friends in the majority on the Science Committee apparently unwilling to have a realistic and productive conversation about Arpa-E funding in this Congress. However, we still have an opportunity to pass a truly bipartisan Arpa-E bill out of this committee. My bill, H.R. 3915, the Arpa-E Reauthorization Reform Act of 2019, includes the key policy reforms included in this legislation and includes a realistic funding profile for the program, authorizing over $130 million increase in funding over 5 years, reaching $500 million by 2024. And I want to remind my colleagues that we are proposing an amount that is $100 million more than what was included in Chairman Johnson's Arpa-E authorization bill from the last Congress. We're making an effort to find consensus. I can't support the bill we're considering today, but as someone who is committed to reauthorizing Arpa-E, I hope that before we consider legislation in the full committee, we can agree on a compromise approach that will actually have a chance of becoming law. With that, I would remind all my colleagues, I've been a member of the legislative process long enough. I understand and respect the fact that the majority has the right and the responsibility to govern. But the minority also has the right and the responsibility to be heard, and today we're using this opportunity to stress these points that we think are critical to a successful reauthorization of Arpa-E. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you to the ranking member. Does anyone else wish to be heard? Okay, we will now proceed with the amendments in the order of the roster. The first amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Illinois. He is recognized to offer an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 1, amendment to H.R. 4091, offered by Mr. Foster.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize the gentleman from Illinois for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope I don't use the 5 minutes here. I'm introducing this amendment to establish a Chief Evaluation Officer position at Arpa-E. The National Academies recently issued an assessment of Arpa-E in 2017, and while the report was generally positive in terms of Arpa-E's technological advancements, and its effective program and project management, the authors noted a few areas of potential improvement. One area that was in need of attention was Arpa-E's evaluation and assessment program. These are findings 4-9 and recommendation 4-8 in their report. The Academy found that the agency is not yet able to fully assess the full extent of its impact and achievement on its statutory missions and goals. They also found that Arpa-E is not doing a good job of creating awareness of its successes in enhancing the economic and energy security of the United States. The report recommended that, quote, the Arpa-E director and program directors should develop and implement a framework for measuring and assessing the agency's impact in achieving its missions and goals. Now, I don't believe that Congress should be overly prescriptive in telling Arpa-E how to best measure and assess its impact or better communicate its success to lawmakers and the general public. So my amendment simply creates a position of Chief Evaluation Officer in Arpa-E. The Chief Evaluation Officer coordinates, promotes, sponsors, and builds capacity within a federal department to help that agency understand and conduct evaluations. The results of these evaluations can be used to improve policies and programs, as well as communicate success of the agency to the public. Other federal agencies have such a position and benefit greatly from having this position filled. It will be left, under my amendment, it would be left up to Arpa-E and the Chief Evaluation Officer to determine how to best measure impact and communicate its successes. The position would also provide some institutional memory in Arpa-E, where the director comes in as a political appointee and initiates a number of, by design, fairly short-term projects, sort of to provide the agility and flexibility that we all hope will continue to make Arpa-E productive research and development enterprise. However, so I think it's a tremendous idea, and however, I was very pleased to find that since introducing my amendment, we have learned that Arpa-E now plans to hire an evaluation and impact assessment expert to help them respond to the National Academy's recommendations. So this is a tremendous example of, I think, first off, the real value that Congress gets from the National Academies and other sources of technical advice, and also the way we benefit from having a collaborative relationship between the Congress and the agencies that it oversees. So, Mr. Chairman, I hereby withdraw my amendment and look forward to working with the agency to ensure that this critically important role is effectively filled using existing authorities. Now, thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Indiana. He is recognized to offer an amendment.
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 2, amendment to H.R. 4091, offered by Mr. Baird.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Chairman Lamb. My amendment to H.R. 4091, the Arpa-E Reauthorization Act of 2019, would replace the authorized funding levels with more reasonable numbers that have been received bipartisan support in the past. In the 115th Congress, Chairwoman Johnson introduced H.R. 3681, a Arpa-E reauthorization bill that was co-sponsored by 39 members, including 5 Democratic members currently sitting on this committee. My amendment simply takes the exact funding profile proposed in the bill and adds it here. This funding level would be a modest, reasonable increase in spending, with funding reaching $390 million in fiscal year 2022. After supporting it last year, I see no reason why Chairwoman Johnson and my Science Committee colleagues could not support this funding level again. Good policy doesn't change the results of an election or based on who controls the House of Representatives. And successfully reauthorizing Arpa-E will take a collaborative bipartisan approach. The funding levels I propose in this amendment are also reflected in Ranking Member Lucas's bill, H.R. 3915. Mr. Lucas's bill, of which I am a co-sponsor, proposes a manageable $130 million increase to Arpa-E over the next 5 years. That bill proposes an increase to $500 million by the year 2024, which I will note is significantly higher than Chairwoman Johnson's bill from last Congress. I believe my amendment is a good starting point, and Mr. Lucas's bill is an excellent compromise. I urge all of my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Are there any other comments or discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman,
Madam Chairwoman, you are recognized.
I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized.
I am sure that my friends in minority think that they've caught me in a tough spot this time. That's because the funding levels in this amendment simply match the funding levels included in the bipartisan Rpe Reauthorization Act that I introduced in 2017. However, a lot has happened since 2017. For one thing, at that time, the Trump administration was attempting to shut down Arpa-E in defiance of the law. That bill, which had 39 co-sponsors, including 11 Republicans, served to send a strong bipartisan message to the administration to change course and support this agency in accordance with its statutory mission. In 2017, Arpa-E's appropriated funding level was also lower than it is today. And I think we can all remember that. At the time, I was serving as ranking member of the committee rather than chairwoman. That bill was my attempt to write a proposal that the previous Republican-controlled Congress could pass. Now it's 2019, and things are a little different. For one, we are now have a series of recommendations from well-respected bipartisan and nonpartisan institutions that calls for supporting Arpa-E at the levels in this bill. Arpa-E's funding levels have increased to the point where the 2020 level authorized in this amendment would make a significant cut to the agency's budget. In fact, even the out-year funding in this amendment would cut Arpa-E to well below the bipartisan House-passed appropriation level for next year. The climate crisis has only grown more urgent, and we have a new congressional majority in the House that is ready and willing to make the investments we need to address it. For all of these reasons, I strongly urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Any other discussion on the amendment?
Move to strike the last word.
You are recognized.
So I'm a freshman. I'm pleased to serve with my friend, Mr. Baird. Neither of us were here in the last session. But as a newly elected member, I think any discussion of fiscal responsibility with respect to the last Congress deserves one 5-word response. $1.5 trillion. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
You are recognized, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I realize that we have a lot of new members in Congress and a lot of new members on the committee. And Chairwoman Johnson and I are kind of the senior members from experience and time. So I will just offer a little thought to my colleagues from my perspective, and I say this respectfully. But as I mentioned earlier, it is the right and the responsibility of the majority to govern. It's the right and the responsibility of the minority to be heard. What we are trying to do is simply say to our friends, you don't control the entire congressional process. You don't control the administration. We're trying to work with you to craft a piece of legislation that gives us a chance to leave this committee and across the floor in a bipartisan way so that we can persuade that other body that might not be quite as enlightened always as we are to join us in this effort to get something signed at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. If this is an aspirational bill, I respect that fully. Going from 500 million to $1 billion is an aspirational increase in 2024. But we in the minority are trying in good faith to work with you to craft something we can get all the way through. We can't control our brethren at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue or the other side of this building, but we can promise you, based on how hard it has been to maintain Arpa-E in recent years, that if we don't work together, we'll wind up doing great damage. So with that, and the greatest of respect for my colleagues, I encourage my friends to vote for Dr. Baird's amendment and to urge us all to consider those factors today and understand the majority will have its way. That's the way it's supposed to work. But we'll revisit this in full committee, and we'll revisit this on the floor, and it'll make it more difficult ultimately. I want to accomplish something. I understand the joys of being in the conscience of the body, as some of my friends on the other side have experienced too. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I respectfully yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. Any
Mr.
further
Chairman.
discussion on the amendment?
I move to strike the last word.
You are recognized.
I appreciate that. What he said, the gentleman from Oklahoma, I yield back.
Thank you. And I will just recognize myself for a moment to say that I very much appreciate the spirit of bipartisanship that survives even in moments where we disagree. I think that our disagreement in this particular case is really a disagreement of degree rather than kind. I think most of us believe in the Arpa-E program and think that it has been successful and is promising. And so it's a debate about how large of a bet you're willing to place on that progress. I think that our hope is that with the support already of 4 Republicans, not one, every one of which we value, much like the good Lord counts every hair on your head, we count every Republican who is willing to support our bills. We hope that on the other side of Capitol Hill and at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, supporters like the Chamber of Commerce and American Gas Association will also carry a lot of weight. So with that, we will vote on the amendment. All in favor, say aye. All opposed, say no. No. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any more amendments? You recognize? False alarm. Okay. A reporting quorum being present, I move that the Energy Subcommittee of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee report H.R. 4091 to the full committee with the recommendation that the bill be approved. Those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objection, so ordered. Members will have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplemental minority or additional views on the measure. We will now consider H.R. 4230, the Clean Industrial Technology Act of 2019, and the clerk will please report the bill.
H.R. 4230, a bill.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I recognize Mr. Caston to present his remarks on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The climate crisis is an existential threat to all life on Earth. It is urgent and it is complicated. I have spent the last 20 years of my career trying to do something about it and found myself frustrated for years that when I came to Capitol Hill, I would be told this problem is too complicated to move quickly. And I fear that in this moment, there's a voice now that says this problem is too urgent to worry about complexity. Both of those paths are suicidal. And this bill is an effort to try to think about some of the complexity in, I think, a thoughtful way. We have three things we have to do to deal with climate. The first is relatively easy. We have to figure out how to use as little energy as possible per dollar of GDP. We have lots of opportunities to do that. Barrier removal, there's a whole host of bills I've been doing leading to do that. All of those will grow the economy and lower the CO2. The second is really hard. We got to figure out how to get 100 parts per million of CO2 out of the atmosphere so that our species can survive. The third is subject to the jurisdiction of this committee, which is that we have to figure out how to make those materials that our society depends on without fossil fuel input. We have no idea how to make fertilizer without natural gas, how to make steel without coke, silicon without coal, cement. And I don't know how to make a solar panel sitting on a concrete pad without steel, silicon, and cement. And I don't know how to feed 7 billion people without fertilizer. So if we are going to make sure that we leave a planet to our children that is better than the one we inherited from our parents, we have to figure out how to do that. And that is the purpose of this bill. If anybody says they already know the answers to those questions, they're lying. They're hard problems, but that's a real opportunity, because if you think about, as a young chemical engineer, you learn names like Haber and Bosch, who invented these technologies to turn natural gas into ammonia, Fisher and Tropsch, who figured out how to take coal and turn it into hydrocarbons that can be used for other things. This is our chance to figure out who are going to be those names that our children and grandchildren remember as inventing the technologies that allowed us to get by. So the Clean Industrial Technology Act of 2019 does exactly that. It directs the Secretary of Energy to establish a Department of Energy-led cross-agency research program to reduce carbon emissions from non-power industrial sectors. This includes everything from research on lowering carbon emissions from iron and steel production, to finding alternative materials for buildings, to reducing emissions from shipping, aviation, and other modes of long-distance transportation. To ensure that these technologies make their way into the private sector, the bill includes a $650 million authorization for demonstration projects. Realistically, that probably covers 3 to 5 large-scale demonstrations that help provide certainty to industry and help the private sector better implement new, lower carbon emission technologies. In a similar spirit, the bill also authorizes a technical assistance program to allow eligible entities to receive assistance from the DOE in working towards the goal of reducing emissions of non-power industrial sectors. In addition, CETA would establish a federal advisory committee that would consist of industry, academic, federal, and labor representatives to help develop the missions and goals of the research program and ensure consistent progress towards achieving those goals, and to develop carbon emission reduction roadmaps in each of the relevant focus areas. This effort's not ideological. It's about averting the climate crisis. It's about American competitiveness. It's about U.S. manufacturing and industry leading the world in a new industrial revolution. The bill is widely endorsed by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, National Association of Manufacturers, the United Steelworkers, the Blue-Green Alliance, NRDC, EDF, and the American Chemistry Council. That's a pretty diverse group of folks, and I'm proud to lead this effort alongside Chairwoman Johnson and Congressman McKinley, as well as Senators Whitehouse and Capito. This is bipartisan and bicameral. I'd like to thank all of them for their leadership and dedication for taking on this issue, and I think that just helps to underscore how important this effort is. I urge support of the Clean Industrial Technology Act of 2019. Thank you, and I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chairman,
So recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Lamb. I want to make just a few brief comments on H.R. 4230, the Clean Industrial Technology Act of 2019. This bill directs DOE and the Office of Science and Technology Policy and other relevant federal agencies and stakeholders to establish a broad, cross-cutting program to develop and commercialize technologies that reduce greenhouse gas emissions from non-power industrial sectors, like manufacturing and material production. While I'm supportive of the intent behind these efforts, I'm concerned that this bill is putting the cart before the horse. We've had a very limited discussion of this bill in committee hearings and received no technical comments from OSTP on this legislation. I think establishing the interagency committee to consult with stakeholders on a future research program is wise. But it doesn't make sense to establish detailed requirements for a brand new program without considering the recommendations of that committee. I'm also concerned that the bill could duplicate research already underway. There are a number of existing research initiatives, and the Department of Energy, like those done through the Office of Fossil Energy and EERE's Advanced Manufacturing Office, that already look to improve efficiency and reduce emissions in power production and manufacturing. These efforts could easily be expanded to apply to a broader range of industrial processes. Why not leverage existing government resources by providing policy direction to these programs before we establish something new? Before I close, I want to make it clear I am supportive of funding cutting-edge research that will help improve efficiency and reduce emissions for energy-intensive industries. But I'd be much more supportive of a bill that established a mechanism for federal agencies to work with stakeholders before we authorize a detailed program. And I'd like to take this opportunity to invite my good friends across the aisle to the table. There is so much we agree on. In the future, I hope we can work together to do our jobs and develop common sense, productive, yes, bipartisan legislation. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Does anyone else wish to be recognized?
Yeah, Mr. Chair?
Mr. Foster?
Yeah, my colleague in introducing this, brought up one example was the energy used to produce fertilizer. And I'd just like to highlight the fact that we have to invest both in near-term development and as well as fundamental research. There's an interesting company that's actually, it's called Pivot Bio, that is now in the field in dozens of states with technology that uses pre-existing bacteria and various ways to make, essentially allow corn to make its own fertilizer. And they have successfully proven roughly a factor of 2 reduction in the need for fertilizer for corn, which will be transformative when it gets widely deployed. This was only possible really because of both long-term and short-term federal investments. The basic understanding of biology, is something that the federal government has been supporting for generations. And now we're seeing that long-term effort cross the finish line. And we're also seeing it cross the finish line with federal investments such as the SBIR program that I believe the award was in 2015 for a company established initially in 2011 that is now proving the technology that may drop the need for fertilizer for corn enormously and maybe even take it to 0. And so this is something that we have to, I think it's part of the job of our committee, to balance fundamental research, I think that we continue to underinvest in, as well as near-term deployments of things that are approaching the finish line. And so I think this, what's in this proposed bill, I think does some of both, and I think it's the sort of thing that we should be ramping up. With that, I guess I never struck the first word, so I'll unstrike the word that I didn't strike.
They were great words. I hate to see them struck. Thank you. Anyone else wish to be recognized? We'll now proceed with the amendments in the order of the roster. The first amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Weber. He is recognized to offer an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will please report the amendment.
Amendment number 1, amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4230, offered by Mr. Weber.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. Recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Chairman Lamb. My amendment to H.R. 4230, the Clean Industrial Technology Act of 2019, would modify the bill to prioritize the role of the advisory committee, provide limited preliminary authorizations for research and technical assistance programs, and establish a timeline for the sunset of this program. By adopting my amendment, I believe this bill could progress to the full committee with bipartisan support, which we all know, as the ranking member said in earlier comments, gives it the best chance of becoming law. As I mentioned in my opening statement, I believe this bill has potential. But to put it simply, I think we're trying to run before we walk, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would allow the advisory committee established in Section 4 of this bill to develop appropriate technology and research benchmarks through the emissions reduction roadmap. I don't think any of our colleagues claim to be an expert in industrial emission reduction technologies. So if we're going to stand up a committee of professionals, I think we should give them the chance to help us develop an effective research program. We should be hearing from stakeholders, academics, and industry representatives who are experts in these relevant fields. By bringing together these individuals with relevant federal agencies, I'm confident we will receive appropriate near-term and long-term qualitative and quantitative objectives that are actually achievable and realistic. I know we're all anxious and excited to do our job, but before we write pages of descriptive directions for agencies, maybe we should let the advisory committee do its job and develop an effective research roadmap for that program. Additionally, my amendment eliminates the, quote, such sums as are necessary, end quote, authorization language from this bill. As an authorizing committee, I believe it is our responsibility to set the funding levels that we deem are appropriate. Allowing the appropriators to set funding levels concedes one of our greatest responsibilities, and I would add privileges. Instead, my amendment would direct DOE to conduct this research using existing funds authorized. With related research already taking place in the Office of Fossil Energy and ERE, the department can expand existing work to meet new program goals. And if after hearing from the agencies, experts, and stakeholders on the advisory committee, we believe additional funding is required to accomplish these goals, let's authorize it. But throwing up our hands and leaving our work to the appropriators, the Appropriations Committee, is simply not the solution. Lastly, this amendment proposes reasonable sunsets for the programs authorized on this bill. We can't allow programs to continue forever, and sunsets force us to come back to the table, do our job, and see if we're still on the right track. I don't believe there's anything in this amendment that my colleagues could not support. But since I'd like to give Chairman Lamb and my Democratic colleagues the chance to come back to the negotiating table and work with us to find a bipartisan compromise on this bill, I'm willing to withdraw this amendment today, Chairman Lamb. Are you willing to work with me to incorporate elements of this amendment before we consider this bill in the full committee markup? I'm asking for you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. The answer to that is no. I will recognize myself in opposition to your amendment, but I just want to make sure that you're done first.
Well, I was trying to make sure that my amendment wasn't done.
Yeah.
Or does get done, and wasn't done in a negative sense. So the chairman is not willing to work with me.
We are certainly willing to work with you long-term about the concerns that you've raised, but our plan for today is to vote on 4230 as it is currently written.
With that, I yield back.
Thank you. I will recognize myself in opposition to this amendment. First, it shouldn't go without, I guess it should go without saying, but we won't allow it to. We will continue to work on the areas where our interests and ideas overlap, and I think that has already happened leading to the development of this bill. Like I said before, I think we have a disagreement more about degree rather than kind. I think it involves the amount of money we want to spend and how we spend it. We all agree that reducing carbon emissions in these sectors is necessary. The reason I oppose this amendment, well, there are several. One is I do think it's part of our job to provide guidance to the DOE and its lab and personnel on what we want them to focus on, and the amendment would remove a lot of that specificity. I've heard that from DOE personnel themselves. I've heard it from researchers at the national labs. They appreciate that direction, and I think that's an important part of our job. I also think the issue of sunsetting the program just respectfully is not well matched to the challenge that we're trying to address here. I mean, we're trying to solve a very, very difficult problem, as Mr. Caston, I think, very eloquently described, which is to take on this problem of carbon emissions in a sector that has seen very, very little innovation and penetration of new ideas. And so there's no indication to me that the problem itself is going to sunset anytime soon. So I don't know why we would start off by sunsetting our attempt to solve that problem. It's going to be with us for quite a while, and it may be something that we want to tailor and fine-tune over time, but I wouldn't call for the ending of it before we even get started. I also think that eliminating the authorizations for these programs and trying to rely on existing funds, again, it doesn't meet the challenge that we're facing. This is a big thing, and it's going to require a lot of sustained investment. It's going to require demonstration programs, which are very expensive but very effective. And so it's not something we can do cheaply, but it's really important. So if the federal government is going to be spending money on something, I would think something related to the future of the planet, but especially life on this planet, in a way that can sustain economic growth is a pretty good bet to be making. So for all those reasons, I oppose the amendment and I yield back. Yield back to myself, I suppose. So anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment?
Move to strike the last word.
You're recognized.
I want to just respond to a couple comments because I think I appreciate the spirit, but maybe just share a little bit of background. Number one, Energy and Natural Resources in the Senate is having a hearing on this right now as well. So just want to reemphasize the point I made in my opening comments that this is a bipartisan, bicameral bill, both in the House, in the Senate. This is not something that is coming out of whole cloth for the first time in this committee. Number two, I really appreciate the comments you made, I guess, at the prior, not your recent ones, but the prior ones. Those were also good. About whether this is duplicative. Energy consumption in the manufacturing space is an orphan child of the federal government. We have an Office of Electricity. The use of energy in the industrial sector, parts of it get done in USDA, parts of it get done in the Census Department, the Manufacturing Consumption of Energy Survey. It was deeply frustrating to me throughout my career, both as an engineer, as a scientist, and as a business person, that there was no programmatic oversight. And so a part of the intent here is to say, let's put this in the Department of Energy where people can really go look at this, because there's a lot of unfortunate duplication because there is no stand-up agency that does this stuff. So let's try to consolidate this in one space. And I think, you know, in the course of that, let's recognize that the funding here, and look, $650 million to the average American is a lot of money. Relative to what we spend on energy research is a drop in the bucket. Spent $10 billion for energy R&D at DOE in fiscal year 2019. We spent $284 million to fund a $431 million project to demonstrate carbon capture and utilization in Port Arthur, Texas, from methane steam reformers. We spent $141 million in Decatur to insert CO2 from an ethanol plant underground. I could make the case to spend a lot more money because, as Chairman Lamb pointed out, the scope of this problem is not going away. This is a huge chunk of our economy. If you look at the CO2 emissions, broadly speaking, depending on the year, you know, 25% to a third is from electricity, somewhere of a similar order of magnitude from transportation, the balance from manufacturing. We're spending a lot on transportation. We spend a lot on electricity. We spend very little researching this, and if we're going to actually get the carbon down where it needs to be, so that we avert the climate crisis, we need to be of a similar scale here. So this is a start. I absolutely agree we're going to need to revisit this down the road, but my God, let's not sunset this program.
Will the gentleman yield?
I will yield back the balance of my time to the chair.
Mr. Chairman, I move strike the last word.
Recognized.
I thank you for that. You make good, the gentleman from Illinois makes interesting points. Staff has advised me that there's a $300 million program in DOE that looks at advanced manufacturing, and so I want to talk about the sunset for a minute. I'm concerned that the bill, as I said in my comments, actually delegates our responsibility to the appropriators. We are the authorizing committee, and glad to be. Does the gentleman from Illinois know of any other process other than sunset that forces us to come back to the table and take a second look and say, is the program doing well? I yield to the gentleman.
I think it's a double-edged sword. If we fund this program and we recognize the scale of the problem, then we will make sure we take it seriously. If we sunset, we are asking whether there are going to be adults at the table the next time this has to come up to revisit it. When I did years ago, I was looking at trying to buy a bunch of biomass assets, biopower projects in the United States from a company that had Canadian, United States, and European assets. And when I asked the CEO why he was selling, he said, because I get a better multiple on my cash flows in Europe and Canada because my investors discount U.S. energy policy as being fickle and changing in every congressional cycle. That is my fear of putting sunsets in these massively important programs, because the general public does not trust us to maintain a consistent energy policy.
Reclaiming my time, with all due respect, I understand that, but we're divided government. The founders set it up that way. We have 2-year members in the House, and I know you know this, 6 years in the Senate, and that's the way this government works. But again, I want to say that the responsibility should fall to us. It does fall to us. It should be we should consider it a privilege, and we should consider it our job, no matter who's in these seats, to look out for the American public, the amount of money spent, make sure there's no duplicative efforts done, there are no duplicative expenditures. And so I simply want to say that I think the sunset provision is reasonable. I want to echo the fact that I think overseeing this, revisiting this, our job to look at this as the authorizing committee or subcommittee, however you want to look at it, is important. We should be exercising that authority, that privilege. We should not be delegating it to anybody else. I think the American public doesn't appreciate that. They hired us to do a job. They elected us to do a job. I think we ought to do our job. With that, I'll yield back.
Any further discussion on the amendment? Okay, the vote will occur on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment, say aye. Aye. All opposed, say no. No. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Illinois. He is recognized to offer the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will please report the amendment.
Amendment number 2, amendment to H.R. 4230, offered by Mr. Lipinski of Illinois.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objection, so ordered. Recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Mr. Caston for introducing this bill. My amendment is relatively simple. I think it'd be a good addition to this bill. I think we'll hopefully have good bipartisan support on this. While some industrial emissions are due to the energy required to make products, emissions are also produced as side products of chemical reactions. Methods commonly used to make steel and cement and the processing of many chemicals necessary for countless consumer products all produce greenhouse gas emissions. This bill already allows for development of new chemical processes that would result in lower emissions. However, as an engineer and a co-chair of the Bicameral Chemistry Caucus, I recognize that a stronger focus on green, sustainable chemistry, principles of green and sustainable chemistry might amplify the benefits. Green and sustainable chemistry lowers harmful impacts on the environment and human health by seeking friendlier chemicals, as well as ways to lower reaction energy requirements. I'm offering this amendment to encourage the Department of Energy's technology development partners to incorporate sustainable chemistry principles as appropriate when carrying out activities described in this bill. Our partners should be supported if, for example, they seek to prioritize the use of environmentally friendly solvents or renewably sourced starting materials. Additionally, our partners should be encouraged to seek reactions that minimize waste and require lower reaction temperatures. This amendment provides flexibility for research in all of these areas. The result is an industrial base with a lower environmental impact, including lower emissions. The world is demanding solutions to climate change, and at the same time, consumers are demanding environmentally conscious products. Encouraging new research and development in sustainable chemistry can meet both of these demands. And if we do the work to meet customer demand here in the United States, we'll position ourselves as leaders in the growing global green economy. We will support our manufacturing industrial base, leading to better consumer products and job growth, and we will create a cleaner environment for future generations. So this amendment would just provide more flexibility to industry partners as they work to make their processes, chemical processes, cleaner. I think it's be a good addition to this bill. I thank the committee for considering this amendment. I encourage my colleagues to support it, and I yield back.
Is there any further discussion on the amendment? The vote will occur on the amendment. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Those opposed, say no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas, and he is recognized to offer an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will please report the amendment.
Amendment number 3, amendment to H.R. 4230, offered by Mr. Weber.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. Recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. My amendment would add a sense of Congress to this legislation. After all, it is about industry, clean energy. I'm sorry, wrong one. Hang on. I can do this. I knew that. Thank you, Chairman Lamb. This amendment requires the programs authorized in this legislation to be carried out using the existing appropriations for the Department of Energy. I submitted this amendment today for 2 reasons. The first is that the department already receives funding for similar work, and we cannot increase top-line spending each time we think we want to set priorities. The second reason is that if we decide additional funds are indeed necessary, as I said, we should do our job. We should do our due diligence and authorize the amount that the department will need each year. Not an open-end authorization with 0 strings attached. I know we all want 0 emissions, but this is a case where 0 strings are attached. Today, DOE's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, or EERE, is funded at almost $2.4 billion with the B dollars. And the department's Office of Fossil Energy Research and Development is funded at $740 million. Within these offices, there already exists programs focused on increasing efficiency and reducing emissions from the manufacturing process that could take on these responsibilities. So instead of including no-limit authorizations, let's allow the advisory committee established in this bill to do its job, like we need to do ours. Let them make recommendations to Congress on the appropriate priorities and technology goals for these programs. Then we can work with federal agencies to authorize the right amount for the right time period to meet the right goals. We all know we don't live in a world with unlimited resources, so it's our job to prioritize the resources we do have and make sure we are investing limited federal dollars in programs that actually benefit the American taxpayer. There's a novel thought. So until we've heard from stakeholders and received enough information to determine if we truly need more funding, let's direct the agencies to carry out this work without increasing top-line spending. I think this is a common sense proposal, and I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Any further discussion on the amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Recognized.
I want to reiterate what I said before about we do not appreciate, I think, at nearly the level we need to the scale of this problem. I quite agree we have limited resources. The most limited resource we have is this planet. And that doesn't mean that we spend every dollar we can, but when I had the pleasure over the last recess of going and visiting NOAA and looking at this million-year history and seeing that over the various interglacial periods, we have gone roughly from 200 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere to 300, and then back down again, and then back up. And we do that cycle after cycle after cycle. Since the Industrial Revolution, we've gone from 300 to 415. The most ambitious plans that are out there among our various presidential candidates probably turn the corner at 500. That 100 ppm swing in prior cycles has been about a 5 to 10 degrees Celsius change in the temperature of the planet and a 120-meter sea level rise. You want to talk about precious resources to conserve? Let's talk about the entire eastern seaboard. Let's talk about the state of Florida. This is not a small issue. $650 million is a tiny, tiny, tiny down payment on what our grandchildren are going to demand of us, because at the end of the day, nobody is going to remember our names on this panel. Nobody is going to remember what the borrowing cost is on the bill. They're going to remember whether they have a planet and what we did when facing this existential crisis. And this is not the entirety of it. Don't get me wrong. We have a lot of other things we have to do, but it's a small price to pay for what has to be done. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, and I'll just recognize myself for a moment to say that I'm opposing the amendment as well. I think in line with what Mr. Caston was saying, the question really is pay now or pay later. I mean, there's really no doubt that we are going to spend hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars trying to clean up from climate-related disasters and emergencies and the effect that it will have on our economy. People have already done that work and tallied it up. There's really no doubt that that's going to affect us in a lot of ways. Agriculture, I mean, you name it. And the thing that we often share in common between Democrats and Republicans, at least on this committee, is that we believe that industry has a role to play here and that we don't want to sacrifice American jobs or American economic growth in the process of changing our grid and changing our country to help contribute to the efforts to save the planet. And so I think what we have here is a pretty balanced example of bringing in industry input, which is how we got the support of people like the American Chemistry Council and 3 Republicans so far, and also just trying to create innovation. And the thing that encourages me is that when you meet with business owners, people in manufacturing, people in the steel industry, where I come from, they desperately want to reduce their own carbon emissions. I mean, it's in every single one of their business plans, and we even see more and more companies now who are tying executive compensation to the reduction of carbon throughout their industrial chain. The point is, it isn't enough. We aren't making a big enough dent fast enough, as Mr. Caston was telling us. There's a time element to this. And so the larger amounts of money that we are trying to authorize and get into these programs, and the reason we oppose doing it with simply existing funding is if existing funding were enough, we'd be seeing a faster rate of innovation and a faster rate of adoption in industry and fewer emissions, but we're not seeing that. So clearly there's more we need to do. For those reasons, I oppose the amendment. Does anyone else wish to be heard? Okay, the vote will occur on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from South Carolina. He is recognized to offer an amendment.
Chairman Lamb, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will please report the amendment.
Amendment number 4, amendment to H.R. 4230, offered by Mr. Norman.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lamb. In light of the previous discussion, in respect for everybody's time, I will briefly put this amendment up. Basically, it's what Randy put up, but it's limited. It would establish a sunset for programs and committees established by this legislation. And, I think as all of us in our businesses and families, we have a look-back period. This does not alter anything with the legislation other than, on September 30th, 2024, it requires a look-back. I think that's a common sense approach to every program we have. That's our job, as Mr. Weber brought up. Secondly, with respect to the debt that was mentioned by my friend from Illinois, this we can all agree on is something that to curb debt, you look at every program. It's just like a credit card. There's no one item. And while this may or may not be a good cause, you take a look at it and reevaluate it. It sends a message to the committee members that we're looking at the funding. So with that, I yield back.
Any further comments on the amendment? Okay. And I will recognize myself just briefly to say I oppose the amendment for many of the reasons stated. I do share the concern that my Republican colleagues have about making sure we monitor these programs, look back at them, be sure that they're working adequately. I think as you can tell from our comments today, the members on the Democratic side view this as among our highest priorities as a nation and are very concerned to be sure that we get it right. So I don't think we see ourselves as having to tie ourselves to holding future hearings and examining whether the money is being spent well. And we think that opposing these sunsets will help provide some assurance both to industry and to the researchers and decision makers within DOE itself that this is a commitment we are prepared to make for, until the problem is solved. Again, this is not about sort of arbitrary 5-year periods. It's about solving the problem, and that might take us a while. So for those reasons, I oppose the amendment. Does anyone else have any further comments? The vote will occur on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. No. Noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. He is recognized to offer an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not going to offer that amendment at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, are there any other amendments? A reporting quorum being present, I move that the Energy Subcommittee of the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 4230 as amended to the full committee with the recommendation that the bill be approved. Those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no? No. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes. Without objection, so ordered. Members will have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplemental, minority, or additional views on the measure. I want to thank the members for their attendance. This concludes our subcommittee markup.
Nice job, Chairman.
All right.
You've done good.